So for our final keynote today, I believe we have a name that shouldn't require much of an introduction. It's Charles Hoskinson, who is a co-founder of Ethereum. In addition to that, he is a founding member of Input Output Hong Kong, which is working to develop a third-generation cryptocurrency called Cardano. I hope that you all join me in giving him a warm welcome to the Start Engine Summit. We're very excited to have him here today.
Hi, everybody. You all look a little bit tired. I'm tired, too. It's been a long day. First, thanks, Howard, and thanks, Start Engine, and thank you so much, Chris Cox and the others, for the great presentations today. They were a lot of fun. So, what are we going to talk about? Well, let's talk about a little bit about my travels. I've been to 27 countries this year, and last 3 years I've been to 50. So, I'm becoming a bit of a nomad. Getting fatter, hair starting to fall out. You know, it's what happens when you're on a plane too much. You also start losing hearing. I think these things are correlated. And I was in Ethiopia. I was in Addis Ababa, which is a lovely place. Traffic is terrible. In fact, I've noticed most of the places I go these days, traffic is worse than LA. I didn't think it was possible, but definitely is. And I went to the Startup Accelerator, and we had these lovely people show up, and they pitched me all their ventures, and the coolest was like this Uber for vegetables. So they went to all these farmers, and they went ahead and said, hey, you can register your farm, and when a restaurant needs carrots or something like that, they can just push a button and get 500 pounds of carrots, and you can go deliver it and sell straight to the restaurant. No supermarket, zero supply chain. Pretty cool. Started with very little capital, wildly profitable in the first year. And they said, hey, would you like to invest? And I said, sure, give me a term sheet. Let me take a look. And then it dawned on me. I said, how do I get liquidity for your venture? How do I actually sell the stock that I get? And they said, well, we don't actually have a stock market in Ethiopia. We have a commodities exchange, which was hyper-political. It was very difficult to come through. Game of Thrones is real. It's based on Ethiopia's coffee markets. Careful who you take pictures with. It's pretty crazy. But in terms of equities, nothing. If you actually want to start something and sell it, you have to move outside the country, maybe South Africa, maybe somewhere else. Then I was in Mongolia, another lovely place, even worse traffic than Addis Ababa. It took me 4 hours to go 20 kilometers from the airport to the hotel, and that was pretty soul-destroying, although it's one of the few places where you can see camels walking along the streets. So it's pretty cool. And 30% of the population is nomadic, about 900,000 people. 1.5 million people in the capital. Worst traffic in the world statistically. The roads were built for 100,000 people. 15 times the capacity. It's so bad that basically they passed a law saying that half the cars can't even drive every day. It's based on your license plate number. Imagine that. Oh, it's not my day of the week. So they'd love to build a public transportation system. What's the problem? Costs $2 billion or more to build it. Very expensive. And this is a country with lots of gold and silver, lots of natural resources. So why can't they source the capital? Because they don't have good markets. So we at IOHK do a lot of business all around the world. We have Pan-African strategy, been to Uganda and Rwanda, South Africa, all these places. We deal with countries like Vietnam and Mongolia, and it's a lot of fun to talk to them, and they have common problems, which is that they're excluded from the world financial system as it is. And they would love to come and play, but it's simply just too expensive for them to play. On the compliance side, KYC and AML is horrendously expensive, especially when your lifetime value per customer is $10 or $20. They're excluded because they can't play in global markets. They can't tokenize these things, despite the fact that there's trillions of dollars of value that's locked up. Trillions of dollars of value that could be lifted out, whether it be real estate, whether it be resources, whether it be the SMEs that exist in these countries, which have built real balance sheets. They have cash flow. They have thousands, sometimes millions of customers, but they just don't have access to our marketplaces. So as I get older and fatter, and I enjoy the science and engineering side of the space, what my company does is we try to apply our science and engineering that we do, now more than 16 countries, towards finding solutions for these places. So that's what we do at IOHK. We think about next generation of compliance, and we think about the next generation of cryptocurrencies. So now let's go back in time a little bit about where I came from. I entered this space in 2011, And it was a very different time. My first Bitcoin meetup group I signed up for had 2 people who registered for it, myself and another guy. And I showed up, and the other guy didn't. So I had a great conversation with myself about my love of Bitcoin, and that was a bit schizophrenic. That's okay. So anyway, that was a really Wild Westy time where no one particularly cared. We didn't even think about regulatory compliance because even the regulator didn't care about us. And every now and then they'd throw some guy in jail because they had to, but come on, it was a crazy, weird time. Then 2013 came by, and 2013 actually was a big momentum change for us. You see, the point of Bitcoin was that it was a cognitive experiment for the people who played with it. This concept that you could just issue a token through some sort of decentralized means, and then somehow, some way, people would actually put hard-earned money into that. They'd actually buy it. I mean, think about how crazy of a concept that is, actually. This anonymous hacker over the internet creates some system supposedly backed by code and math. Who knows? Most people can't read it or think about it. And yet somehow, some way, these little tokens that are issued through some sort of bizarre process called mining, people actually go and buy them. In 2013 was the moment where actually everybody said, yeah, that's a really good idea. And the markets went to about $1 billion. So that was really the first generation, this concept of decentralization and this concept of kind of a mass delusion that these things can be worth money. But money is a delusion itself. So then in 2013, we started saying, well, we like this decentralization concept. We like these ideas that, we can push money like email anywhere in the world. But the problem is we don't like a system that's blind, deaf, and dumb. Bitcoin really is not useful. It's almost like the early days of the internet when the web browser first came up and we didn't have JavaScript. You could have these static, boring web pages, and they really weren't interactive, so the experience was whatever the developer can dream up, and that's that. The other side couldn't interact with it. So in 2013, Vitalik and I and others, we said, hey, let's just add a programming language to one of these blockchain structures. Let's see what the heck that's going to do. Now, we didn't think it was actually going to be big. We probably would have done things a little differently had we known that it was going to be as successful as it became. But what it did is it woke up people to this idea of programmable money and this idea of taking old business processes, whatever they might be, the idea of issuing assets, trading assets, the concept of taking the contract and dissecting its actual intent and turning that into code and trying to automate as much as possible and putting that into a system that's time-stamped and immutable and auditable. It's a pretty cool thing if you really think about it. So, 2013, we started building Ethereum, and by I believe it was 2015, we finally launched it. We got it funded in 2014, and it changed kind of everything. That was the second generation. So then what happened next? Well, nothing for a little while, and then suddenly everybody realized this whole Ethereum thing is kind of like a Rube Goldberg machine to be an investment bank in the sky. And 2017 happened, where billions upon billions of dollars were raised by this ERC-20 mania, where people would just go and issue tokens, they'd sell those tokens, and then suddenly they had $10 million, or $20 million, or $30 million. This has never really happened before, where a 22-year-old kid with no business experience and no knowledge could suddenly wake up and have $30 million and an asset and not even a bank account, not even a legal registration. This, believe it or not, has happened in our space. And we're still recovering from this. 2018 was the sobering, oh, wait, that's probably not the best idea. Let's take it back, but we can't year. And we're trying to sort all these things out. So what's happening in the world, because I have the luxury of talking to world leaders now and regulators and all these small and large jurisdictions, is we are seeing a predictable kind of polyfrication where people are all going in their own directions. So some people say, let's look at what the EU and the United States is going to do and say about all these tokens and all these offerings. Let's see what US regulation has to say. A lot of the Western world is biased that way, and the European Union is in some way the same. Then other opportunistic jurisdictions like Barbados and Bermuda and Malta and Gibraltar and the Isle of Man and Switzerland and Liechtenstein, all these nice places, some of which have more bankers than they have farmers, than they have pretty much anything else. They're saying to themselves, boy, it would be really fascinating and interesting if we can get a chunk of this market. Can't do the whole tax evasion thing anymore. That doesn't work so well. So let's go ahead and try to get a leg up in the tokenomics world. And we're starting to see all kinds of really creative schemes being developed. This notion of the utility token and this notion of the security token and all these new concepts about how to do KYC and AML, and some are more permissive than others. And then we see other jurisdictions that have become very draconian. China, for example, says no way, no how. And so far, South Korea is not so happy about it. But there are strong elements in the government that do want to create some sort of a sandbox. So it's a mixed bag between whether one ought to create new legislation and regulation, as Japan did with its laws in 2017, or whether we should just cram this entire space into regulations created 80 years ago, hoping that somehow we can make them work. And there is no consensus within the world. And it makes it really difficult for a guy like me, because at the end of the day, I'm just trying to do stuff. You know, I care a lot about how do I help people? How do I build things for consumers? How do I actually make this useful to them? Because, you know, I was in Sandton in South Africa not too long ago, and I had an opportunity to take some cars out to the townships. These are places with 35% unemployment. Most people make less than $100 a month. And I met this great venture, and they said, hey, can you help us build a land registration system? Because right now you have this problem when people sell their land in the township, they don't tell the government. They just sell it and hand somebody the deed and say, here you go. So when you look at the land registry, sometimes it's 30 years out of date, 35 years out of date. And you know how you find it out? Who owns it? It's called the grandma test. You go find the oldest grandmother in the neighborhood. You say, who actually owned that land? And she'll tell you the whole history. You have to have about 4 hours. You're going to drink a lot of tea, but you'll get the whole history, usually. And you ask the other grandma, too, the second oldest, just to make sure the ledger's right. Well, anyway, so that's kind of the whole thing I do. And I try not to think too much about the regulation, but unfortunately, I'm forced to. So I get asked a lot, where's this all going and what's going to happen? See, we have a lot of problems in our space. Like, there's been hundreds of ICOs issued by American citizens. And to be frank with you, if you're a US citizen, it doesn't matter where you sell your token and who you sell your token to. Somewhere along the way, the US government's going to say they have jurisdiction. You can be selling things to people in Tonga, and you can have it in a bizarre Polynesian language. And if you're a US citizen issuing it or bringing the money back to the United States, somehow, some way, a regulatory body at some point is going to say, you owe us taxes, or you should have filed some form, mea culpa. Because that's just how the world works. And the ICOs that have been issued are probably no different. What's likely to happen is a lot of them are going to get yelled at. And they'll have to say, we're so sorry, and go Reg A or some other exemption, pay a fine, and move on. Government's not crazy, but they need to do something. Regulated markets will form, like Coinbase and T0 and others, and they'll find ways to create liquidity for these instruments that were previously unregulated but are now regulated. But then something else that's going to happen, something pretty magical. Somewhere along the way, people are going to start asking questions, foundational questions about basic things, like, why the hell does it cost so much money to do compliance? Well, it's because what we've told these banks and these financial organizations is that they have to be God. They have to go and learn everything about you, who you are as a human being, your transactions. And if they see anything suspicious, they got to file a suspicious activity report on you, send it to the regulator. So they've been tasked with this duty of trying to figure out whether you're safe or not. And you know what that does? It makes them very conservative. It makes them biased. They see someone from Angola, they say, I don't care if you're Angola's Bill Gates and you're a nice guy and you spend your weekends saving orphans. You're in a high-risk jurisdiction. I just can't open an account for you. So sorry. So then people will start asking, well, can we do these systems differently? Can we start automating things? Like, what if, for example, we move it to a transactional basis and it's just a collection of questions we ask for every transaction, and you query against data warehouses using zero-knowledge proofs? And some cryptographer somewhere would actually understand what that means, and somewhere along the way will actually try it. And you know what? It won't be tried here in the US. It'll be tried in Africa. Because somewhere along the way, somebody in Rwanda, Uganda is going to want to do a cross-border payment, and there's just not good systems for that. And they'll say, how about let's try this? And the government's going to let us do it. And you know what's going to happen is, just like Bitcoin, it's going to work somewhere. And when it works, more people will do it. And when enough people do something, you know what happens? It changes the world. We've had many regulations in the history of this nation. Until 1992, it was illegal to sell things on the internet. The NSF AUP, the National Science Foundation Acceptable Use Policy, they said, oh, we can't repeal this non-commercial clause in the AUP because the internet will become a cesspool of spam and pornography. And that happened, but we got Amazon. And we got many other great businesses, and these people have changed the world as a result. And similarly, if enough people start doing something, the law will eventually change. It's malleable. That's why you see things like the Jobs Act from time to time. That's why you see things change. But here's my final point about all of this, is that I'm just a guy, and you're all just people. And we tend to think we get titles and money, and we've been in the game long enough that we're serious and prominent. But the reality is that we're only as good as the tools we have, and we're only as good as the people we serve, the customers we have, and the markets we live in. And something has happened over the last 25 years. The markets have changed in a very subtle but profound way. The reality is that you're now doing business, whether you like it or not, with the entire world. And our systems of regulation and our systems of compliance and our payment systems and our financial systems aren't designed to accommodate that. So setting cryptocurrencies aside, the world has to change. We live in a country, the United States, that has had financial dominance over the world for a long time. It was us or the Soviets. That was the Bretton Woods Agreement from 1944 on. And now we're living in a world that's now no longer monopolar, it's multipolar. There's a pivot to China, there's all these factions rising up, and the dominance of the dollar is starting to recede. We're still relevant and powerful like the UK, but moving into the future, the US regulators aren't going to have the same power that they used to reach into arbitrarily any country, anywhere, anytime, and tell them, hey, this is the way it ought to be, this is what you ought to do. Instead, they're going to have to negotiate. And you know what happens when you have to negotiate? Your culture changes. Your society changes, because you can no longer mandate. When you're used to saying, do this or else, and you have to now say, we request that you do this, the world changes. So over the next 10 to 20 years, we're going to see great fortunes made. We're going to see a lot of things change. But one thing I'm absolutely certain about is that we're going to settle upon a completely new world financial system. And what it's going to look like is a lot of the things that are really expensive right now and take a lot of time right now are going to be completely automated. A lot of jobs are going to go away. If you're the chief compliance officer of an organization, maybe you should consider a different vocation in 20 years, 30 years. And that's probably a good thing, because it's not good spending every 3 years the entire value of the city of Tokyo on your job. And we're also going to see money start moving at the speed of information. And we're going to see tons of financial creativity. You know, I'll close with a story about some of the things we saw in the coffee industry in Ethiopia. There's this practice called stumping. What the heck is that? It's where you're a coffee grower and you go and chop down your tree, an old tree, kind of worn down tree. Still has productive capacity, but it's getting old. You chop it down, it regrows. And when it regrows, you get about 2 to 3 times as much coffee production from it. So why don't the farmers do it? Because they can't afford to do it. They lose the productive capacity. That's money out of the pocket now in exchange for money in the future. So what do we have to solve that? Credit. When these new systems come into play, when this new world comes into play, somewhere soon, 5 years, 10 years, some farmer somewhere can be asking a person in this room for a loan of $50 or $100 to stump their trees, paying 20, 30% interest. That's a reality that's going to come, and we're going to see billions to hundreds of billions of dollars flowing all around the world to the people who need it the most, with the rates and risk of that going down, and it's going to change their lives. It's going to make the world a much better place. Just like the innovation of our financial markets in the 19th and 20th century made America a superpower. It's going to make the whole world rise up. So each and every one of you is part of this. We all have our parts to play, whether they be regulatory or technological or scientific. It doesn't particularly matter. We have a wide spectrum of opinions. The government's going to have to give a little bit, and we as entrepreneurs are going to have to give a little bit, because there are problems like consumer protection issues and insider trading and these types of things, and people just aren't going to stop being bad. That's just the reality. We have an orange president, for God's sakes. So thank you guys so much for your time. Thank you for attending. Thank you for listening to everyone. And let's all go get drunk. Cheers.